What is happening here and now in this trying USA, China, Europe? Has anything changed over the past year while we are with you? Well, maybe a little less. Yes, while we were not talking. What do you think happened important?
М,
Well,
Ну, давайте
let's
по
take it in
порядку.
order. I
Я
don't
не
think that there
думаю,
was
что
any separately
произошло
important
какое-то
event.
отдельно важное событие.
It's
Просто
just that
все
all
те
those processes,
процессы,
the
начала
beginnings of which
которых
could be
можно было
observed a
наблюдать
year
год
ago,
назад,
are,
сегодня,
in a sense,
можно сказать,
accelerating
в
today.
каком-то смысле ускоряются.
More
Точнее,
precisely,
даже не
they do not
ускоряются,
even
а
accelerate, they
переходят
pass into a
в
different
иную фазу,
phase,
в
into a
иное
different state.
состояние, но
But
тем не менее это
nevertheless,
раскрытие
it is the
тех же самых
disclosure of the
идей,
same
тех же
idea,
самых
the same
процессов.
processes.
А
The fundamental
Фундаментальный
process does
процесс
not
не
change.
меняется.
This is
Это
the end of the
конец
Western-centric world, the end of Western
западноцентричного
hegemony,
мира,
and attempts to
конец
adapt to this
западной
process.
гегемонии и попытки адаптации к этому процессу.
The attempts
Попытки
are very
весьма
chaotic for the reason
хаотичные
that
по той
for
причине,
most of the
что для
Western
большей
elite,
части
the
западной
very recognition
элиты
of the fact of losing hegemony is
само
an
признание
unacceptable
факта
thought,
потери
a thought that is
гегемонии
denied
является
even before any
мыслью
conversation,
недопустимой,
any discussion
мыслью,
begins.
которая отрицается еще до начала всякого разговора, всякой дискуссии.
As a result,
В
the
итоге стратегия
strategy is
строится,
being
мягко
built,
говоря, не
to put it
слишком
mildly,
адекватная.
not too adequate. The
Стратегия
US
США в этом
strategy in this
плане
regard
тоже
also does
не
not differ
отличается
in the long
долгосрочностью,
term,
потому
because we
что
basically
мы, в
cannot
принципе,
talk
не
about
можем
the
говорить
existence
о
of a single
наличии в США
policy in the US
сегодня
today
единой
as such.
политики как таковой.
In
То
other
есть мы
words,
видим
we
несколько
see
разных
several
элитных
different
групп
elite
в
groups in the
США, у
United
которых
States who
принципиально
have fundamentally
разные
different ideas about
представления о
exactly
том,
how a foreign
каким
policy
образом
should look
должна
like.
выглядеть внешняя политика США.
And here it
Здесь
falls.
падает
And
визит,
here the
заключается
peculiarity of
особенность
what
того,
Wells
то,
says in the
что,
United
ну,
States.
говорит, в
Foreign
США
policy
внешняя
is
политика
conducted
ведется по
according to the
старой
residual
схеме.
principle. In other
Служащие
words, the
каждого
best
большая сила
personnel, the
традиционно
best
тратится
forces,
на
are
внутреннюю
traditionally
политику,
spent on domestic
а внешняя
policy, and
политика
foreign
часто
policy
отдают
is often given away,
как
well,
бы на
as you can
подряд.
call it, for contracts.
Outsource.
Well,
Ну, не то
not to
чтобы на
outsource,
аутсорс,
but
но
because they are
больше
still
все
their
равно
own
свои
people.
люди, но
But
как
let's
бы,
say, the
скажем
requirements for
так,
their competence, I
требования
would
к
say,
компетенции,
are much
я бы
lower than,
сказал,
for
сильно ниже,
example,
чем, например,
competence in
компетенции
domestic
во
political issues.
внутриполитических вопросах.
In other
То есть это
words,
просто
this is just a
свойство
property of
американской
American domestic
политической
political
жизни.
life. And
Ну и,
finally,
наконец,
about
про
China.
Китай
I
повторюсь, я
repeat,
всегда говорю,
I
что я
always
не
say
принципиальный
that I
эксперт
am
по
not a
Китаю, но
principled
насколько я
expert
могу
on
сказать,
China, but as far as I
Китай
can
тоже
tell,
находится
China
в
is also
стадии
in the stage of
адаптации
adaptation with
с
this new
этим
world. Well,
новым
with this
мировым, с
transition.
этим
On the one
переходом.
hand,
С
he
одной
is very
стороны, он
happy with
очень
him.
рад ему,
He
он
welcomes him
очень
very much.
приветствует,
He
он говорит о
says
том,
that the
что
time of
наступает
China is
время
coming,
Китая,
the
день
world of
Китая.
China. On
С
the
другой
other
стороны,
hand,
мы видим,
we see how,
насколько,
let's say,
допустим,
relations between
отношения
the United
США и
States and
Китая
China are
развиваются по
developing,
модели
according
«никто
to
не
the
хотел
model. No one
противостояния,
wanted a
но оно было
confrontation,
неизбежно».
but it was
То
inevitable.
есть,
That is,
вне
regardless
зависимости
of the
от того,
pronounced
значимых
attempts to
попыток
negotiate,
договориться,
force majeure
обстоятельства олимпиады
circumstances
силах
lead to the
говорят к тому,
fact
что
that it will not
договориться не
work out to
получится.
agree.
Let's then return to the topic of the end of the Western-centric world and say that. And let's remember that the West has repeatedly experienced a time when it would seem the situation in the West was not as brilliant as we would like, yes. And in this sense, why now it seems to you that this particular period has come right now and that it is getting its development, the end of the Western-centric world. And what replaces it? Let's get back to this topic again. It seems to be important.
Well, it
Ну,
depends on
меня
how long
достаточно
you are interested in.
интересует.
If it is
Если
short term,
долгосрочный
then this
вопрос,
world
мы
is
говорим
being
про
replaced by war.
война.
In other words, I have been defending the
10
theses of the 30
войны
Years' War
отстаивают 2
for 2
года,
years,
даже
even
раньше.
earlier.
То
In other
есть
words,
все
400
400
years of
лет
Western
западного
domination
доминирования
began with the
началось
30
с
Years'
30-летней
War
войны,
and will end
закончится
with the
такой
same 30 Years'
30-летней
War.
войной.
Well,
Ну, можно
maybe
так,
there's a
30
25-year-old,
может,
maybe a 35-year-old czar. In fact, we are talking about such an initial process. In other words, this is a large scale, as it were, radical boundary restructuring. If we talk about Western dominance, then again, it depends on what distance. You say that he had fundamental problems, but in fact, first of all, Western dominance is a relatively new phenomenon. If you look even at the total share of GDP there, I do not know the 18th century in the world. Then there will be China, India, and so on. It's just that GDP was a function of agriculture, in fact.
And let's have a second, Pavel. Let's have a second then. Let's clarify right away then what is dominance and what will we take as a basis. That is, well, somehow.
Let's say, no, well, dominance is the key peak of Western-centric dominance, when in fact the whole world was was a colony of Western countries in the literal sense of the word. That is, we can say this is the 18th century, the 19th century, the first half of the 20th century. The peak, perhaps, can be said to be a kind of symbol too, at the end of World War II, when the United States alone produced 50% of the world's industrial GDP. Its dominance. That is like this. The second part of domination, this is ideological dominance, when all meanings were born on the commandment, when big meanings, moreover, these meanings, which could be imposed by force, somewhere by beliefs, imposed on all other participants in world politics, and it was assumed that this is the most obvious and it is good for all mankind. Well, the classic expression of this idea in its final version is the end of Fukuyama's story. In other words, this so-called liberal world ode, the liberal world order. In other words, this is also a characteristic feature of Western dominance. Well, according to each one, if we talk about the signs why this is ending now, then they are very clear to us. The first one, well, since the first one, by the way, is ideological, is that Western ideas are no longer interesting to anyone for the most part. They are no longer interesting to anyone, even in the West, and in the East, Yuga and Africa there, they are not even more interesting. That is, well, if you try to seriously promote the idea of liberal democracy as a basis for the global world order today, you can imagine how successfully, let's say, this policy will pay off for you. There is a change in the direction of real interests. There are a lot of tough ones in some sense, but a little more honest than the previous world. Secondly, it's like we already have a lot more data here. This is an economic issue. Well, that is from the point of view of economics. The West has ceased to be the economic center of the world. The economic center of the world is really moving to Southeast Asia. We see this in the statistics of industrial production. We see this happening in India, China, Southeast Asia. In other words, they are becoming key regions of global economic growth. Actually, today's confrontation between the United States and China is taking place for the markets of Southeast Asia, who will conditionally control the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Myanmar, Thailand. These are all these countries. In other words, this is the key issue. If we evaluate it in the near future, this is such a key issue. A key contradiction between China and the United States, on which they will not be able to agree, because there will not be enough of this market for two. This will go either to China or America. And the third point is very significant for me, of course, demographic. That is, especially Europe. The US is still in a much better position, but especially Europe has passed the stage of demographic. In fact, the point of no return. In other words, European nations are dying out. They cannot ensure their own fertility. Accordingly, this is a very significant indicator that their value will decrease with each decade.
Let's go back to some of the thoughts you just said. Right, so you said that Western ideas are not interesting to anyone, and said, but let's imagine who is interested in the ideal of liberal democracy now. And in this sense, I have two clarifications. Was the idea of liberal democracy interesting to the countries of the global south? And when? Is that the first question? Come on, yeah.
Well, the peak, of course, comes in the 90s, on the fall of the Soviet Union, on, well, we can say a kind of liberalization of China, that is, on the so-called period of China's opening to the world order. If we are serious, then this idea, well, accordingly, the whole so-called theory of democratization counted, that most of the countries in the world were really democratic, well, they sought to become democratic, and well, really seriously. This is the so-called third wave of democratization. That is, it peaked in the 90s. And at least it's not interesting, but everyone was forced to say so, at least in words. And you and your politicians strive to match these democratic ideas with the democratic ideal. The departure from this ideal begins only in the 2000th years, when, well, the first phase of departure begins. It is very much like this. Well, I would call it hypocritical, that it is hypocritical, but it is so, you know, half-hearted, relatively speaking. Qualifying epithets begin to be added. Not liberal democracy Hungarians, sovereign democracy in Russia, democracy with some face there in China, in India, and so on. That is, everyone begins their own, relatively speaking, additions. In other words, we are like a democracy, but we are a special democracy, which in fact meant a departure from this very ideal, which was spreading after the 90s. But it is unequivocal that, at the moment of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was the peak of this, if you like to say it correctly, the peak of the attractiveness of this liberal ideal, when in fact, what was the market offer for the world community? Democratize, modernize, and you will be happy. In other words, you will be rich, successful, beautiful, just like we are the countries of Western Europe, and quite like it was such a mainstream position. In other words, a huge amount of money, resources, visits by politicians were included in the creation of these democratization networks, if you like. So it was a period. It was pretty big. It's not very long lasting, but it was very bright of a kind, yes.
Well, if we look at it offhand, then which countries, you can say so, which countries have become democratic right into this?
Look, I'm not talking.
This is very.
Oh no, oh, no, oh no.
Or what?
That, a delicate moment. I'm not talking. I'm not talking.
Yes.
One more time. I'm not talking about the fact that they have become democracies. I'm talking about the fact that the idea was attractive. These are slightly different things. The attractiveness of the idea, I repeat, was due to the fact that the countries in the early 90s, well, in fact, the countries of the second and third world, that is, the post-Soviet countries in the broad sense of the word, the countries of the former socialist bloc, and the countries of the global south, that is, the countries of the third world, were offered the following by the conditional West. Well, that is, what kind of idea was it? In all the statements of politicians, experts, economists, there is little to great. It sounded something like this. You want to become, live like in the West. Here we have the ideal of a consumer-free society. Rich, successful, beautiful there, do this, that. In other words, if you want to be rich, successful and happy, be like us. This idea was proposed, and in the 90s, for the most part, this was shared by most of the elite, not even by Western countries, but by the countries of the post-Soviet countries of the global South. That is, there were of course fundamental differences in what pace to go, what method to go, what way to do it. It's just that, you know, there it was written in the library in the 90s, dedicated to how to democratize someone. That is, just because I studied it even at one time, while still a student at the institute. Believe me, a huge amount of literature has been written on these issues for each of the countries. That is, just well, the experts sat and wrote even, that a huge number of people simply wrote libraries of the essence of useless information, but nevertheless, it reflects the attractiveness of this very idea. History began to break down when it became clear that liberal democracy and economic growth, if they are interconnected, are not as directly as we would like. Examples of China, examples of India, even examples of Russia, they very much broke this beautiful picture. In other words, it has become obvious that economic growth is not necessarily possible only under conditions of transformation, that is, under conditions of smart westernization. The fact that westernization is separate, economic growth, economic policy can be separate, and that's why this consensus is gradually changing. It was the period of the noughties. Well, then it went.
Let's go back. What you just said is interesting. You said that it became clear to the Liberal Party that liberal democracy is not directly related to economic growth, but then economic growth and liberal democracy may not be tied like that, but let's tie freedom and economic growth.
The same thing.
It's connected.
Look, the same thing has arisen, that connections have arisen. Everything has become much more complicated than the straight, I repeat, simple design that was proposed in the 90s. In other words, there are big discussions going on now. To what extent freedom? What kind of freedom? Well, for example, China's experience has been analyzed a lot, which, relatively speaking, let's say economic freedom, yes, contributes to economic growth, but political freedom has nothing to do with it at all. That is, like a huge amount.
Can it be so?
Well, here's an example. So no. So the example of China has shown that at least everything is not so unambiguous. Yes, that is, as if compared to how it was supposed in the 90s. It's just that we are now looking at the intervals of 30 years since we have started this conversation. So I'm just describing evolution to you. That is when the big doubts began. In particular, very big doubts have begun to arise in this issue for a huge number of countries. Moreover, well, the crisis processes in the West began to increase. Again, if the West of the 90s is the West that you want to match, then let's say the West of the 10th, well, to put it mildly, is a much less attractive position from the point of view of much more traditional societies. Yes, we are talking about a new, come on, I do not know that YouTube did not criticize us, progressive. Everyone understood the ideology. It is connected with the colors of the rainbow flag, and with other processes. This has become a very big stumbling block on this whole wonderful path of cooperation. In other words, and in fact, for many countries in the South, and even post-Soviet ones, let's not go even very far, but even for Hungary and Poland, for example, it would seem that this has become a big question for the more lateral European countries. In other words, countries want to preserve their sovereignty in the field of this ideology, for example, and there is a conflict again with that zone of liberal democracy, which was supposed to be universal for everyone in the 90s. And if it is not universal for everyone, then a huge field and space opens up, for maneuver, adaptation. And again, the very idea of a single liberal global order is being undermined here. Therefore, these processes have been going on gradually, but they have come, I think, now by the time of 2024 year. They have reached the point where they have practically become self-evident, and it is possible to state the fact that the project of Western liberal hegemony, namely liberal hegemony, has ended more or less calmly. That is, there remains an option for the United States. We do not have that option. It is practically inevitable that the United States will preserve the status of a great power, which will be one of the key ones in this epic concert. That is, superpowers, that is, but not superpowers. A very important point, and this, by the way, is a fundamental moment that is happening now, that there is not a single superpower in this stage of change. China does not claim to be a superpower. That is, he can claim, even I do not know how much they are. I do not follow. I cannot follow what the Chinese write inside themselves. But, under the influence of China in the international arena, and it is clear that China will not be able to replace the United States as a superpower. Moreover, Russia will not be able to replace it. But, neither Russia nor China actually publicly claim you. All of them claim the status of a great power. And in the same way, the United States, ceasing to be a superpower, becomes a great power. What is the difference between a superpower and a great power? That a superpower can impose its will on everyone at any moment. The notorious global policeman. There simply is not, and will not be such a state in the near future. What will lead to what? That's right. This will lead to the fact that all frozen conflicts and contradictions will gradually be revealed and require their resolution.